This paper is the philosophy of law. The current module is entitled Digital Divide, Theory, Policy, and Practice. The objectives of this module are to understand this idea of digital divide and to see what steps can be taken to overcome it. The module was written by Sudarshan Padmanabhan from IIT Madras. I'm Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University in Rome. What do we mean by this term digital divide? Digital divide refers to the lack of access to knowledge through information communication technology. We can use the short form ICT for information communication technology. Now, what we mean by ICT is, of course, those sorts of internet technologies and other technological modes of communication that basically bring vast amounts of information to easy access. Digital divide, then, is the divide between certain groups of people who have easy access to this large, vast amounts of information, so for example, access to the internet, access to the World Wide Web, to Google search engines, and so on, that bring immediately and quickly all kinds of information that was previously not available. So a divide between people who have access to this ICT and people who do not have access to this ICT. The lack of access to ICT deprives people of the technology-enabled resources for a knowledge economy. Well, what do we mean by a knowledge economy? So in the knowledge economy, what we're referring to is an economy that is more and more filled with skilled labor rather than unskilled labor. Unskilled labor is what you need for simple production and production according to the factory line model. But to be globally competitive requires a nation to have an ever-increasing amount of skilled labor. Skilled labor is secured through access to technology and education systems that train people in the latest ICT fields. Now, ICT is widely used in numerous fields like education, governance, transportation, health, finance, management. You would have noticed by going into any bank now that rather than the data being written in by hand into large ledger books and so on, information is typed into computers. So the replacement of ledger books and law books and analog systems of tracking information by computers and digital systems is an example of the way that society is changing with the introduction and use of ICT. Now, it's impossible for somebody to compete with a digital system by using analogical methods. The digital divide then suggests that some of the people have access to the ICT, whereas others are still reliant on analog methods. Who is going to be able to compete in a globalized world? Those with access to ICT, obviously, are the only ones that can push forward a knowledge economy. So that is the idea of digital divide and what we mean by it. What is the basic problem behind this notion of digital divide? Well, according to the political philosopher Pippa Norris, digital divide is at once a global, a social, and a democratic divide. In other words, Norris says that the digital divide has three basic domains where you see it playing out. The one is, of course, the global scale. That means that there's a basic digital divide between the fully developed and the currently developing nations. Now, the fully developed nations will be, for example, Western Europe or the United States. So you will find in these fully developed nations that any kind of analog system will be fully replaced by a digitized ICT oriented system, even in the humblest of occupations. For example, in Western Europe, for instance, a plumber might come to repair your toilet, and in issuance of the bill or in showing you what parts are required, he or she might pull out a smartphone where that information is immediately accessible right there. The part number, the sort of piece that is required to fix a job and how much it costs. You can easily compare that to your everyday experience. The plumbers that we have would be lucky to have experienced any kind of vocational training, much less the possibility to have access to ICT to facilitate the way that he can perform his job. So clearly, at the global level, there is already a digital divide between the developed nations and the developing nations. Then you can come one tier down, the digital divide as a social divide, that is between the information rich and the information poor. So even at the global level, within India itself, while the disparity between the access to internet technologies within India on the whole is far less than it is, for example, in the US or the UK. Within India, there are also disparities in that there are certain classes and communities that have far more access to ICT than other classes and communities. And not only that, the access that certain classes and communities have within India is in fact on a par with those in the United States or the UK. What that suggests is that the community to which these persons who have ICT access within India, the community to which they belong, shares more in common to the other communities abroad than it does to their own countrymen. In other words, if you belong to one of those communities that has everyday Wi-Fi access, everyday internet, all kinds of digital appliances, and you've dropped all of the analog ways of living life. You have your smartphone, you do your reservations with credit cards online, and all of these things. You, in the practice of your life, have more in common than people who don't belong to your country than you do to the masses who do belong to your country. So this is a social divide aspect of the digital divide. Well, the social divide introduces clearly another concept then, which is the democratic divide. Because those who have more access to ICT clearly have more access to the processes of government and governance. For example, if you want to download an application form for a passport, a service rendered by your government, if you have no access to electricity, we've already got one problem. But even where electricity is common, you won't find ICTs necessarily. So the availability of the use of a computer that has a sound connection to the internet, that has a connection to the printer, that can allow you to print off the form for a passport, is more readily available to those who enjoy access to ICTs than those who don't have that privilege or prerogative. Now, what does that suggest? Every Indian citizen has a right to apply for a passport, but that right is more easily fulfilled by those who have access to ICT. Therefore, there's a clear democratic divide, or an access to government divide, that is displayed through those who have access to technologies and those who don't have access to technologies. So what Norris's suggestion of understanding the digital divide in these three phases or three moments, they all tend towards imbalances. And if, on the one hand, we can clearly recognize the democratic deficit that is suffered by those who have no access to computers and internet technologies within India, what does that mean on the global scale for those countries who have far less and far less frequent access to internet technologies and to digital technologies? What we find, therefore, is that the developed nations have already built-in advantage insofar as they have more ready access to technologies. And so global competitiveness is already tipped in favor of those who have and enjoy ready access to ICTs. Now, this kind of imbalance should be looked at empirically, but it can also be understood from a philosophical angle. So I'm going to spend some time now in moving away from the digital divide in concrete and to talk about the political philosophy of the 20th century American political philosopher John Rawls. There are other modules in the philosophy of law paper that treat of Rawls in relation to political and legal philosophy, so we won't get into all aspects here, but I'm just going to introduce those aspects that are important in order for us to see how to move from the problems of the digital divide to certain solutions that we can take, certain steps that we can take. Now, John Rawls, in The Theory of Justice, published in 1971, suggested that there are basically two principles of justice. These principles are divided, are referred to as the first and the second principle of justice, and the second principle of justice is further subdivided into two parts. The first principle of justice emphasizes equal civil and political rights. So this first principle is commonly known as the liberty principle. If the first principle is known as the liberty principle, then obviously, since these are the principles of justice, the second principle will be known as the equality principle. The second principle of justice emphasizes fair equality of opportunities. But the second part of the second principle of justice also has a special name, and we refer to it as the difference principle. What the difference principle suggests is that in spite of the first principle of justice, which is the liberty principle, we can in fact arrange society in certain cases to reduce the liberty of others if the result advantages those who are least advantaged in society. So in other words, you can think about redistributing wealth through taxation. Taxation collects money from the population, and then the amount of money that is in the coffers of the government will get redistributed so that perhaps some of the taxes that were taken from the wealthy will be used on expenditures for the poor, for the least advantaged. So this is a process of redistributing wealth. Now, libertarians are radically opposed to this kind of redistribution of wealth, because what are you doing by taxing the wealthy and taking that money, which is property, away from the wealthy and giving it to the poor? What you're doing is you're basically violating their freedom, you're violating their liberty, you're taking their property. Now, this is a basic idea in political and civil life, that nobody should take your property without compensation. But taxing, as we say, taxing the rich and giving that money to the poor, what is that other than taking your property without compensation? So libertarians are strongly opposed to this, but John Rawls created a scenario where for justice to work, there must be an element of social justice built in. And that element is built in his second principle of justice, second part, which is referred to as the difference principle. So you can violate the first principle, liberty, only on the condition that in doing so, you're giving advantages to the least advantaged. So he lays out a condition that is seemingly just. Everybody could reasonably assent to that. That if you're going to violate somebody's liberty, you can only do it if in the process you're giving advantage to those who are least advantaged by the system. Now, the system certainly disadvantages certain people. There are systemic disadvantages that people suffer. If the system overall is to be just, then it has to deal with those systemic injustices. It has to deal with those systemic disadvantages. And the way that John Rawls says you can deal with those systemic disadvantages is through the difference principle. So we can reduce some people who enjoy the benefits of the system, we can reduce their liberty slightly if in doing so we increase the advantages of the least advantaged. So this is the way that justice works in the political philosophy of John Rawls, if we think about the two principles of justice in a theory of justice published in 1971. Now, what does this have to do with the digital divide? We've already mentioned that the digital divide refers to the fact that there are various kinds of divisions and opportunities and accesses. So one group of people has plentiful access to ICT, to different kinds of technologies, digital technologies, and that kind of access advantages them. Now, I don't think anybody in India is generating their own electricity, creating their own telecommunications network that emits their own Wi-Fi frequency and creating the fiber optics and so on. In other words, each of us who has access to digital technology has that access precisely because of the marketplace and the role of government in it. So in other words, if there were no taxation, there would be no Wi-Fi that we claim is something that we have fair access to. So when you see that the infrastructure provided by government and certain telecommunications companies working in line with government regulations and in accordance with the rules laid down by government, when you see that these are the conditions that permit you to enjoy and reap the benefits of this internet technology, what you can see, translating it into Rawlsian language, is that you are benefiting from the system. So the system is put in place and you happen to be in an advantaged position to reap the rewards of that system. But those on the other side of the digital divide who have no access to ICT are therefore the losers of this system. They belong to this country. The government is theirs just as much as ours who have access to these technologies that are built upon the infrastructure given by the government. And yet they reap no advantages, they reap no benefits from this system. Quite the contrary, since we know that the knowledge economy depends upon skilled labor, and we know that these skills are generated by access to information and training, what's happening is that those who are on the benefit of the digital divide will continue to increase their skill set, their knowledge, and continue to increase their access to information and the kind of jobs, capital, and profit that they can get. Those who continue to have no access to digital technologies will continue to be unskilled labor, which will continue to not produce enough surplus wealth that can be spent on education, that can be used to give them access to digital information. So what we do recognize through the digital divide is that we have a basically unjust system. We have a system where there are certain people who systemically advantage, and that advantage multiplies on its own basis, and we have people who have no access or entry into the system, and yet everybody is equally an Indian citizen. Now, the next part of the module then attempts to piece together this Rawlsian way of thinking with the digital divide and come up with certain solutions to this problem. But let's be more concrete about what the problem is, because we're not merely talking about technology, we're talking about education more broadly. And so this portion of the module is going to discuss the current status of the attempt by the government of India to provide universal primary education, universal secondary education, all under the scheme that is referred to as education for all. So, education for all, in terms of primary education, refers to children between 6 and 14. Now, this, as everybody knows, it's a country with a very young population. So, if you are trying to educate universal education of all children between the ages of 6 and 14, what are we talking about? We're talking about 200 million children. Now, this is the quantity that we are dealing with here, 200 million children. We want to provide 200 million children with a quality education There's no point in educating people into the old-fashioned processes that just result in unskilled labor. So we have a quality issue, which is that we want to give a quality education. We have a quantity issue because we're not talking about 30 children, we're talking about 200 million. And then, although we already know that the problems of balancing quantity and quality have been a great burden in governance, we have a third element to be introduced here, which is the equity element. In other words, India has suffered from large-scale caste discrimination, which has systematically disadvantaged not just anyone, but specific castes of people. So the socially disadvantaged sections, the Dalits, the tribals, female gender, these systemically disadvantaged also have to be taken into account in terms of the quantity-quality problem we already face. So not only do we face the problem that we need to introduce a quality education, because there's no point introducing an education of no quality in a global world where we need a competitive population. We have the quantity problem because there are 200 million people that we have to educate between ages 6 and 14. We also have the equity problem because out of those 200 million people, a fourth of them have been systematically, historically excluded from the education process altogether. This we refer to as the trifecta of challenges to education for all: quantity, quality, and equity. All right. Now, we have discussed the digital divide. We've discussed John Rawls's political philosophy. We've taken a moment to put the two things together provisionally, and we've discussed the task and the trifecta of challenges of universal education, education for all. Now let's start to use John Rawls's way of thinking in order to come up with a solution to this trifecta of challenges. And we do this by concentrating on what we call ICT Enabled Education. Now, ICT Enabled Education is, according to the argument of this module, the only way that we can possibly rise to the challenges of quantity, quality, and equity that are posed by the Education for All initiative. What ICT Enabled Education does is it links together quality, quantity, and equity. Now, how is this so? Because ICT Enabled Education is naturally suited to a superior kind of education pedagogy. It's activity-based learning, and it's an active learning methodology. Why is that the case? Because when you introduce ICT into the education system, you are not introducing it exclusively to students. In fact, the teachers themselves have never been exposed to ICT-enabled education. So what happens then? Let's say we introduce computers into primary schools. We don't have magically appearing computer proficient faculty and teachers in that school. So the courses designed to benefit from the computer technology, in other words, the computer science courses and the other courses on how to use and exploit that technology, will be not taught by the teacher, but will be guided by the teacher. The teacher, him or herself, will be learning along with the students. And many studies show that the most successful kind of pedagogy is that where there isn't a hierarchy between the teacher and the students. In other words, when everybody sees themselves as progressing and learning together. So ICT, the introduction of ICT into primary and basic education serves the function of improving or enhancing the quality of education by introducing by force a superior education pedagogy. Now, what about quantity? The effective teaching and learning environment for almost 200 million students is not made more difficult by the introduction of technology. It's in fact made simpler. As we had discussed with the example of the bank teller and the old analog style entry books versus a computer, why is it that banks have shifted from analog bookkeeping to computer technology? Precisely because what computers can do is deal with massive amounts of quantity with much greater ease than analog methods. So the task of educating 200 million students is, in the process of educating 200 million students, made easier by the means of educating those 200 million students. In other words, computers help deal with the quantity and allow you to distribute syllabus, distribute papers, provide access to the reading material and so on in ways that are far more efficient than in old-fashioned photocopying of books or purchasing of hardbound books. So the argument here is that the very nature of internet technology and computer technology functions as a medium to make the quantity problem easier to deal with, since it is computers themselves that we use to deal with massive amounts of quantity. So that's the quantity issue, that's the quality issue. What about the equity issue? Well, we've discussed already the digital divide. So if you have a digital divide that produces imbalances of access to knowledge and information, and it allows the group that has access to ICT to benefit and those who have no access to be disadvantaged, obviously the solution to the equity problem is to address the equity problem. That is, to provide digital access to the least advantaged. So the problem of the digital divide is that it magnifies imbalances and inequities. The solution to this problem is to redistribute that access to the technology. So in other words, if the digital divide contributes to certain people having better education in this so-called education for all, then the mandatory implementation of ICT for all those 200 million students automatically overcomes the digital divide. So every single primary age student is educated into internet technologies, and by that universal practice, you have already taken the first step to overcome the digital divide. So we can see how the introduction of ICT as part and parcel, or the means by which the education for all policy gets implemented, can serve to deal with the inherent trifecta of problems to attempt to introduce quality education on such a massive scale on a deeply divided society. So the solution to the problem of quality education for all is the introduction of computer technologies at the most basic educational level. Well, how does this match up with the way that we discuss John Rawls's political philosophy and theories of justice? One of the other elements of Rawls's theory of justice is to distinguish between formal justice, so what we say we should have for everybody, and actual social substantive justice. Now, formal justice is apparent in this notion of universal education for all. Here's a perfectly beautiful, just, formal assertion that every single child in this country between the ages of 6 to 14 will have universal access to education. Well, that has a formal beauty to it, but does it have any substantive reality? None whatsoever, because what we know is that the digital divide, the caste divide, the class divide is going to be the means and mechanism through which certain of those 200 million children do receive a quality education on global standards, and the rest who receive hardly anything at all. So maybe they spend a few hours in school each day, but what is it that they learn? They learn no vocational skills, they certainly learn no smart skills, they learn nothing that will provide them the basis for cultivating a skill set that will allow them to compete in a knowledge economy, and certainly one that is globally competitive. So we have here a huge gap between the formal justice idea and the announcement of universal education and the real possibility of social justice, the real possibility of implementing that social justice. What Rawls has argued is that purely formal principles, if they are not filled in by substantive content, do not give us a state of justice. So a condition which he refers to as reflective equilibrium, an equilibrium, a balance between the formal principle and the social justice practice, so a balance between formal justice and social justice. How do you achieve reflective equilibrium? Obviously, through the mechanism of the difference principle. So we have this articulation that is quite grand about everybody's fundamental freedom and equality, but we don't take any steps to ensure that the least advantaged have the same access that the systemically advantaged do. Reflective equilibrium requires the activation of the difference principle. Now think about that analogously with the idea of universal education. The argument being made by Professor Padmanabhan in this paper, in this module, is that the only way that universal education can be more than an empty formal claim is if the mechanism used to bring about that education for all is the implementation of ICT. So the argument here is that education for all is a universal, which is somewhat empty and formal, and the only way to bring it about is to use the means of ICT. And in the very process of using internet technologies for education, you're realizing social justice. You realize social justice because you deal with the equity problem, the access to information that has been denied to a large portion of those people whom we want to educate in the first place. So the argument has been that the Rawlsian political philosophy can allow us to understand how best to implement the universal education for all legislation by supplementing it with something that functions like a difference principle, which is to say, to ensure that the smallest school in the most far-flung places necessarily has a ICT component in order to ensure that the education of the least advantaged has a bare equality of opportunity to get the kind of skill set that we readily give to the most advantaged. Thank you very much.